A racist cop mocked a young black boy who claimed his father was a legendary U.S. Army general, but that humiliation, that precise moment of public shame, was only the beginning of a story that would leave an entire school in stunned silence, an officer without a badge, and a boy finally seen for who he truly was. It happened on a morning that was supposed to be full of pride and celebration, the school's annual Honor Your Hero assembly, where students brought their parents to share stories of courage, inspiration, and sacrifice. One by one, proud mothers and fathers walked across the auditorium stage, receiving applause, smiles, and warm handshakes. The camera flashes lit up the room like fireworks, each student glowing as their parents stepped forward. But when a boy stood alone, holding nothing but a worn photograph of a man in full military uniform and a tiny American flag crumpled in his hand, the room changed. He wasn't supposed to be alone. He wasn't supposed to feel that sharp emptiness in his chest. His father, a decorated U.S. Army general with over 20 years of service and countless lives saved, was deep in a covert mission overseas, and couldn't make it home in time for the event. But that didn't stop the boy from standing proudly in his place, ready to honor his dad anyway. Until he stepped in, a white police officer assigned to provide security at the event. As the boy waited for his turn on stage, the officer leaned down beside him, chewing a toothpick, eyeing him with casual cruelty. "Where's your hero, boy?" he asked with a sneer, pretending to scan the crowd. "Let me guess, ran off, or locked up." The boy turned his head slowly, eyes burning, voice steady. "My dad is a general in the United States Army. He's overseas on a mission. But I brought his picture." The officer chuckled, loud enough for the nearby parents to hear, some of them turning their heads. "A general? You? Come on now. You really expect people to believe you got a dad like that? That man in your photo? That's probably a stock image from Google." The words hit harder than a slap. The boy's fingers clenched the frame of the picture. Whispers spread like wildfire across the rows of chairs. A few students snickered. One of the teachers turned away awkwardly, pretending not to have heard. The boy's chest rose and fell quickly, the color draining from his face, but he said nothing more. Because what do you say when your truth is treated like a joke? When the very person assigned to protect and serve chooses instead to humiliate and dismantle your pride in front of an entire school? The officer wasn't done. He shook his head, raising his voice just enough to make sure his words traveled. "Next thing you'll say is your dad's best friends with the president. Please. Sit down, Junior. Heroes don't skip their kid's big day." That was the moment the camera from the school news club, filming from the side of the stage, caught it all. The boy's pain. The officer's grin. The silence of those who should have spoken up. And as the boy slowly sat back down, shoulders heavy, shame wrapping around him like a winter coat, he felt smaller than ever, not just because of the insult, but because no one said a word in his defense. But what no one knew, not the officer, not the teachers, not even the boy himself, was that everything was about to change. Because at that very moment, thousands of miles away, a military helicopter had just touched down. Boots hit the ground. A classified mission had ended. And the man in the photo? He was already on his way home, unaware of the storm waiting to greet him. Over the next few days, something ignited. The video of the incident leaked online. At first, just a few views. Then a few thousand. Then national attention. What started as a moment of humiliation became a spark that lit a fire too big to control. Civil rights groups spoke out. Military veterans came forward. But the real twist, the true turning point, didn't come until the general himself, still in uniform, walked into that very same school, unannounced, and demanded to know who it was that disrespected his son. No shouting. No threats. Just one presence. One stare that cut through decades of arrogance and ignorance. What followed was not a fight. It was justice, deliberate, strategic, and final. Not just for the boy. But for every young kid who had ever been told they weren't good enough. That they were lying. That they didn't belong. And yet, there's still something you haven't heard. Because what this general did after confronting the officer wasn't just about revenge. It was about legacy. About truth. About ensuring that this kind of humiliation would never touch another child the way it touched his. And the final blow? The moment that shook the entire town, the punishment that came down from above, not out of anger, but out of righteous, calculated decision, would not only remove a badge, but rewrite the future of the very system that tried to break his son. But how exactly did he do it? And what happened to that officer, after all the cameras were gone? Stay with us until the end, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, pride, and payback. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. If you're a black viewer watching this right now, know that we see you, we hear you, and your story matters. This channel exists to shine a light on injustice through powerful storytelling, and to remind the world that dignity, strength, and justice always find a way. Enjoy the story. And don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more emotional plot twists that speak truth. The sun hadn't yet climbed high over Charlotte, North Carolina, when 11-year-old Malik Carter stepped off the yellow school bus, his backpack swaying against his back and his heart pounding in a rhythm that felt heavier than usual. He wasn't nervous about schoolwork or missing homework. Malik was one of the top students in his grade. It wasn't about friends either. He got along fine, even if he kept a small circle. No, today was different. Today was Honor Your Hero Day, a celebration where students brought their parents to share their stories, who they were, what they did, why they were heroes. And Malik's hero was thousands of miles away, wearing combat boots in an undisclosed location, leading a mission no one in that school would ever hear about on the news. Malik had spent the past week preparing. He chose his clothes with care: khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and the green military cap his father had given him on his 10th birthday. His mother helped him print the photo, a black-and-white shot of his father, General Anthony Carter, standing with rigid posture in full uniform, eyes calm, medals glinting on his chest. Malik kept the photo in a cheap silver frame he'd polished until his fingers ached. He practiced his speech in front of the mirror, in front of his mom, even whispering the words to himself on the bus. He didn't care that his dad wasn't going to be there in person. He was proud, and today, people were finally going to know who his father was. Malik lived in a modest neighborhood not far from the city's center. His mother, Denise Carter, worked double shifts at the local clinic, and although she smiled often and spoke softly, there were always tired lines under her eyes. She didn't complain. Raising Malik mostly alone while her husband was deployed came with sacrifices, and she made them with quiet strength. They didn't have much, but they had dignity. Malik's room was small but full of books and posters about science and space. He dreamed of being an engineer one day, building things people thought were impossible. He kept his dad's letters in a shoebox under his bed, reading them over and over like sacred texts. His father was more than a soldier. He was a myth in Malik's world. Strong, fair, and unbreakable. But the school Malik attended was a different world entirely. Jefferson Middle wasn't dangerous, but it was divided. Not by walls, but by glances, assumptions, and the slow erosion of trust. It was the kind of place where white kids had teachers who knew their parents by name, and black kids had hall passes questioned twice. Where expectations were uneven, subtle but suffocating. Malik felt it every time someone looked surprised at his test scores or asked how he talked so proper. He was used to it. His mom had taught him how to carry himself, how to choose his battles, how to stay composed. Keep your head high, she'd say. Let them think whatever they want. You know who you are. The auditorium was already buzzing with excitement when Malik walked through the front doors. Parents milled about, students adjusted their ties or smoothed out dresses. There were balloons tied to chairs and a makeshift stage with a microphone stand. A banner read, "Heroes Among Us." Malik found his assigned seat near the back and settled in quietly. The framed photo rested on his lap, and he glanced at it often, as if drawing strength from his father's gaze. On stage, the event had already begun. A firefighter received applause after telling a story about saving a family from a burning building. A nurse shared how she'd stayed on duty for 3 days straight during the pandemic. A businesswoman talked about building her company from scratch. With each story, the crowd clapped, sometimes stood, sometimes cried. Malik clutched his speech and rehearsed the opening lines in his head. He imagined the moment people would understand. When they'd realize his father wasn't a story he made up to impress anyone. He was real. A decorated general with stars on his shoulders and a legacy bigger than anyone in that room could measure. And then came Officer Brent Malloy. He wasn't part of the event lineup. Malloy had been assigned by the city to provide extra security for the school that week. A 39-year-old cop with thinning blonde hair and an ever-present smirk, Malloy had a reputation in the community. He didn't hide his disdain for kids who talked back or acted bigger than they were. He didn't like being challenged, especially by those who reminded him, consciously or not, of the fragility of the badge he wore. He believed in authority, not justice. And he liked using moments of vulnerability to reassert control. Malloy noticed Malik sitting alone, holding the picture. He wandered over, slow and casual, hands resting on his duty belt. He stood beside the boy for a second, pretending to scan the crowd, then leaned down, his voice coated with condescension. Waiting for someone, champ, he asked. Malik looked up, unsure whether to answer. My dad. He's a general. In the army. He couldn't be here. But I'm still gonna speak. Malloy raised an eyebrow, lips twitching. A general, huh? That right? Yes, sir. Well, the officer said, straightening up, guess he couldn't find the time for his kid's big day. That's a shame. Malik blinked. He's on a mission. He couldn't come back. Malloy scoffed, loud enough for a few people to turn their heads. Sure he is. General Carter, huh? Next you'll tell me he's best friends with the president. Come on, kid. That photo looks like it came out of a magazine. Stop pretending. The words tore through Malik like barbed wire. His throat tightened, and all the courage he'd spent days building began to unravel. He tried to say something back, but the lump in his chest held the words hostage. Malloy chuckled and walked away, leaving behind nothing but shame in the space where pride had stood just minutes before. No teacher intervened. No adult corrected the officer. The moment passed like it was nothing, but to Malik, it was everything. And the worst part wasn't the insult. It was the silence that followed it. The unspoken agreement from those who heard and said nothing. That silence spoke louder than Malloy ever could. When it was finally Malik's turn to speak, he stood on stage with trembling hands. His voice wavered through the speech. He told the audience who his father was, what he had accomplished, why he was proud. But the sparkle had gone. The applause was polite, but restrained. Some didn't know whether to believe him. Others still remembered what Malloy had said. The doubt had seeped into the room like smoke. And Malik, standing beneath the Heroes Among Us banner, suddenly felt like an outsider in a room meant for celebration. When he returned to his seat, he sat quietly. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stared at the photo in his lap, trying to make sense of how something so pure could be turned into a punchline. He'd always believed truth was enough. That if you spoke it clearly and calmly, people would understand. But that day taught him something different. That sometimes, truth alone doesn't win. That sometimes, people need proof, not because your story isn't real, but because they've already decided who you're allowed to be. At home that evening, Denise hugged him tightly. She didn't ask him to talk. She just let him sit with his feelings. And Malik, though he didn't say much, quietly made a decision. He wouldn't forget what happened. He wouldn't let it define him. But he would remember. Not just Malloy's words, but the silence that followed them. Because one day, things would be different. One day, everyone would know exactly who General Carter was. And more importantly, they'd know exactly who his son was, too. Malik didn't speak much the following week. He went to school, came home, ate dinner, and stayed mostly in his room, the photo of his father no longer displayed proudly on his desk but tucked under a stack of books like it had become too heavy to look at. Denise noticed the change immediately, but didn't push. She was the kind of mother who knew when silence was a shield, and she waited. Still, there were quiet gestures, extra time spent on his lunch, a folded note with kind words inside his bag, more hugs than usual. But Malik's world had shifted. The weight of being called a liar in front of everyone, the sting of knowing that even the teachers had turned a blind eye, built a wall between him and the things that used to feel safe. At school, whispers floated through the halls like drifting leaves. Some kids avoided Malik, unsure how to approach him. Others repeated the story with theatrical mockery, mimicking Officer Malloy's voice and laughing about General Google. A few classmates, like Zoe and Tariq, tried to offer comfort, sitting closer at lunch or walking with him between classes. But the damage had rooted itself deep. Every smile felt like pity. Every look felt like suspicion. And the officer? Malloy still walked the halls, the same smug grin on his face, chatting with the staff like nothing had happened. Worse, he'd been praised in a school newsletter for his dedicated presence and service to student safety. That made Malik feel sick. One afternoon, Malik was called into the guidance counselor's office. Ms. Freeman, a well-meaning but distant woman with glasses that slid down her nose, smiled too gently as she spoke. "Malik, I heard about the assembly. I just wanted to check in. Sometimes these events stir up big feelings, especially when family can't attend. You know you're allowed to feel disappointed, right?" He stared at her, the words hollow in his ears. Disappointed? That was the word she chose. He swallowed hard before responding, eyes locked on the wooden corner of her desk. It wasn't that he didn't come. I knew he wouldn't. He was working. It's what happened after. What he said to me. What everyone else let happen. She blinked, then nodded slowly. Well. I'm sure he didn't mean to hurt your feelings. That was when Malik stopped talking. After that meeting, something hardened inside him. It wasn't just about the insult anymore. It was about being erased. He realized that sometimes, even your pain had to be convenient for people to recognize it. And if it made them uncomfortable, they'd smooth it over with euphemisms and smiles. But Malik had no interest in being soothed. He wanted accountability. He spent his evenings researching. Not schoolwork, but the policies of the Charlotte School District. Complaint procedures. State laws on officer conduct in public schools. He even started watching videos online, stories of other kids like him, interviews with civil rights lawyers, archived news clips about abuse of power. His mother didn't question the hours he spent at the kitchen table with his laptop. She noticed the shift, he wasn't withdrawing, he was preparing. Then, one Friday afternoon, a teacher left the staff lounge door cracked, and Malik heard something that sent ice down his spine. Officer Malloy, standing by the vending machine, was laughing with two teachers, his voice clear and confident. All I did was ask the kid a question. He got all choked up, like I insulted his imaginary friend. General Carter, my ass. That boy's daddy probably works at AutoZone. The teachers chuckled awkwardly, one of them saying, "You have a way with words, Brent." That was the moment Malik's last shred of patience died. He couldn't keep waiting. He needed his dad. That night, he finally showed Denise the full story, what Malloy had said, what the other kids repeated, what the teachers ignored. She listened, her jaw clenched, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. And when he was done, she stood, walked into her bedroom, and came back holding a red folder. Inside were documents, military ID copies, letters from the Pentagon, official commendations, and a scanned copy of a medal awarded to General Carter for his leadership during a classified operation overseas. Malik stared at them, speechless. "You want them to know who your father is?" Denise said, her voice low and firm. "Let's show them." The following Monday, Malik brought the folder to school. He gave it to the principal's office, requesting a meeting. When the secretary asked what it was regarding, he answered, "A school-sanctioned humiliation." That got their attention. He was given a brief slot that afternoon. Principal Simmons was a tall man with a calm voice and the tired demeanor of someone who'd spent too many years avoiding conflict. Malik handed over the folder, explained the incident, and listed the names of witnesses. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He laid out the facts like a lawyer, confident and clear. Simmons nodded slowly. "I wasn't aware it had gone that far." "That's the problem," Malik said. "You weren't aware. Because no one thought it mattered." Later that evening, Simmons called Denise. After a quiet conversation, he promised to look into it further. But Malik had already learned that promises meant nothing without follow-through. So he did what he didn't think he would. He wrote to his father. The message was simple. A few paragraphs. He didn't beg or dramatize. He laid it out, the event, the insult, the silence, and the way people dismissed his story. He ended it with one sentence that trembled as he typed it, "Dad, I don't want you to fix this, I just want them to finally believe me." He didn't expect a quick reply. But 2 days later, his mother opened the front door and froze. Malik looked up from the kitchen and saw the expression on her face shift from shock to fierce, silent pride. Behind her stood a tall man in uniform, his boots dusty, his face sun-worn, his posture unshakable. General Anthony Carter had returned home. He hugged Malik like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. Then he looked him in the eyes and said, "I read your message. We're going to make this right." The next day, word spread through the school faster than any rumor ever had. A decorated military general was in the building. Not for a speech. Not for a photo op. But on business. Malik walked beside his father through the front doors. Silence followed them down the hallway. Teachers stared. Students parted. And when they reached the administrative office, the door was already open. Principal Simmons rose immediately, visibly sweating. Malloy was seated to the side, his arms crossed, his usual smirk nowhere to be seen. General Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He presented evidence. Military credentials. Service history. Proof of Malik's identity. He laid it all out like a commander debriefing a room that had forgotten the cost of silence. Malloy muttered something about misunderstanding, but Carter turned toward him, his voice still calm but sharp enough to cut steel. "You didn't misunderstand. You dismissed. You humiliated a child. And you did it in uniform, in a school, in public. That's not a mistake. That's a decision." Malloy said nothing more. After the meeting, General Carter didn't go home. He made a series of calls, to the city, the school board, and one to a contact whose name no one in the room recognized but whose position made everyone straighten in their seats. Whatever quiet storm was brewing in that office, Malik didn't fully understand yet. But he could feel it. Something was shifting. For the first time, people were listening. For the first time, truth had weight. And by the end of that week, the video from the school news club resurfaced online. Uncut. Unfiltered. The moment of humiliation, captured in grainy footage. The laughter. The silence. Malik's face. It spread like wildfire. Not just locally, but nationally. The backlash was swift. But what would come next, what General Carter had set in motion behind closed doors, was bigger than a viral video. It was something permanent. Something that would send shockwaves through the city, the school system, and every officer who thought a badge gave them the right to belittle and erase. The consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were coming. And no one, not Malloy, not the teachers, not even Malik, was ready for just how far this reckoning would go. The following Monday, the school atmosphere felt off, thick with anticipation and unease. The air was heavier, quieter, like everyone sensed something big was about to happen but didn't know what it would look like. Malik walked into Jefferson Middle with his shoulders square and eyes forward, flanked by his father, who wasn't wearing his uniform this time, but whose presence still drew gazes like gravity. There was no announcement over the loudspeakers, no special event planned, but word had already spread. Not through official emails or posters, but through whispers in locker-lined hallways, text messages passed between parents, and tense conversations among staff. People knew something was coming. They just didn't know how close they were to watching the ground shift beneath their feet. It started in the library, where a closed-door meeting was scheduled. General Carter, 2 representatives from the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, and a lawyer from the National Association of Black Military Families had convened. Principal Simmons was present, his usual authority muted by the company he found himself in. At the far end of the room sat Officer Brent Malloy, arms crossed, face hardening with the kind of silent defiance that tried to mask a growing panic. Carter remained composed, but there was no warmth in his voice as he laid out the chain of events, supported by physical documentation, video footage, and now, a formal complaint backed by federal channels. But it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about legacy. Systemic exposure. And the first domino had already fallen. "Let's be clear about what this is," Carter said, his voice even but filled with quiet force. "This is not a father defending his son. This is an officer using his position to humiliate a minor, in public, with no cause, then being protected by silence. That silence ends today." Malloy shifted in his chair, jaw clenched. He finally spoke, his tone laced with frustration. "You people are making a circus out of a misunderstanding. I didn't touch the kid. I didn't arrest him. All I did was mock him," Carter cut in, eyes steady. "You mocked him. You questioned his identity, denied his truth, and turned your own prejudice into a spectacle. And worse, you did it under the authority of a badge." Principal Simmons tried to mediate, his voice brittle. "Let's not turn this into a confrontation. We're trying to work toward a solution." "There is no middle ground in dignity," said one of the federal reps. "We're here for accountability. Not compromise." And then came the moment that no one expected. The door opened, and in walked the superintendent of Charlotte schools, flanked by a city official and the director of school security services. They hadn't come to watch. They'd come to act. A prepared statement was read aloud. Effective immediately, Officer Malloy was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But the real blow came when the city official handed him a sealed document, one that carried the weight of state oversight and civil complaint. A formal recommendation for permanent removal from any school-based law enforcement role, effective across the state. Malloy's eyes scanned the paper, then snapped up in disbelief. "You can't be serious. One complaint and I'm out. Just like that?" "It's not one complaint," the superintendent replied. "It's the first one we listened to." Malloy stood, his voice rising. "You're doing this because of him? Because he got his daddy to pull strings?" Carter didn't flinch. He stepped forward, calm as ever. "I didn't pull strings. I opened a door. And you're the one who walked through it swinging." Malloy's voice cracked, anger blending with something close to fear. "You don't know what it's like, dealing with these kids. Always looking for trouble, always lying, trying to play victim." Carter cut him off again, not shouting, not moving, but with a presence that made everyone in the room lean in. "My son didn't lie. You did. You lied the moment you chose your own assumptions over his truth. You used your badge to erase him. And now you want to play the victim? No. You don't get that luxury. There was silence after that, deep, uncomfortable silence. Malloy's breathing was ragged. His face flushed, his hands curled into fists at his sides. But there was nowhere left to run. No authority to hide behind. No community support to lean on. For the first time, he stood completely exposed, not just as an officer, but as a man who had built his power on the backs of silence and fear. And that foundation had finally cracked. After the meeting, as Malloy was escorted from the building, not in handcuffs, but under the watchful eyes of people who no longer saw him the same, students gathered in the hallway. Some recorded the moment. Others simply watched. Malik stood among them, not smiling, not gloating, but quiet. Reflective. He felt no satisfaction in watching someone fall. But he felt something deeper. Peace. Validation. A sense that the world, if only for a moment, had tilted back toward justice. Later that day, in a special assembly hastily organized by the school, Principal Simmons took the stage, his face somber. Students and parents filled the auditorium again, but this time the energy was different. The banner from "Honor Your Hero" still hung at the back, faded now, but still present, an ironic reminder of where it all began. Simmons cleared his throat. "We are here today not just to recognize a mistake," he said, voice tight, but to acknowledge the harm that mistake caused. A harm we failed to address in time. To Malik Carter, and to every student who has ever been made to feel invisible, we see you now. And we are sorry. Then, he stepped aside. And from the wings, General Carter walked onto the stage, not in uniform, but with presence. He looked out at the crowd, then to his son, and began to speak, not about military operations or medals, but about truth. About dignity. About what it means to be heard. He didn't name Malloy. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew exactly who had been responsible, and more importantly, who had shown the strength to stand against it. As he finished, he called Malik to the stage. For the first time, the applause wasn't hesitant. It wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Real. Malik stood beside his father, not as a victim, not as a boy who had been silenced, but as someone whose voice had finally been heard. And yet, just as the audience began to settle, a final unexpected moment sent a ripple through the room. From the back of the auditorium, a woman stood up, a teacher from another school in the district. She held up a piece of paper and spoke loudly, voice trembling with emotion. "I have a student," she said. "Black boy. Brilliant. Last year, he was accused of lying about his father, too. That officer, the same officer, he was assigned to our school before this one." Gasps echoed. Another thread pulled loose. Another truth brought into the light. It wasn't just Malik. It never had been. The reckoning had only just begun. The silence that followed the teacher's revelation wasn't empty, it was loaded with electricity, a collective inhalation that no one quite knew how to release. Eyes turned toward her as she stood in the back of the auditorium, gripping the edges of the paper in her hand like it was anchoring her to something real. Her voice shook as she spoke, not from uncertainty, but from finally breaking the dam she had held back for too long. She didn't need to say the officer's name again. Everyone knew she was talking about Malloy. And in that moment, the room changed. It wasn't just a story about one boy anymore. It was a chain, a pattern, a legacy of unchecked power, and now it was unraveling in front of a crowd that could no longer pretend it hadn't seen. General Carter remained still, his hand resting on Malik's shoulder, but his eyes locked on the teacher with a quiet intensity. He stepped forward, voice calm but piercing, asking her gently to come to the stage. She hesitated, then slowly made her way down the aisle, her steps echoing against the polished wood floor. When she reached the front, she turned to the audience, her words steadier now, fueled by something deeper than fear, truth. "It was different last year," she said. "No video. No assembly. Just a report, filed and forgotten. The boy's name was Isaiah. He was suspended after defending himself when Malloy called him a liar in front of the class. Said no kid from our neighborhood could have a father working in aerospace. The principal told us not to escalate things and Malloy was transferred shortly after. But Isaiah never came back to school. He left feeling humiliated, defeated. The murmurs rose again, louder now, anger blooming in the room like a sudden fire. People looked around at one another, some shocked, some guilty, others nodding with bitter recognition. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was systemic rot exposed to the light, and it had a face, a pattern, and now, a name. Malik looked up at his father, eyes wide with realization. He hadn't been alone. And while that should have been comforting, it only deepened the wound. How many others had there been? How many hadn't spoken up because they thought no one would believe them? Denise, seated near the front, rose slowly and walked toward the stage. Her steps were deliberate, not hesitant. She joined her son and husband, her face a mixture of sorrow and fire. She took the microphone and turned toward the crowd, scanning their faces. "We came here for justice," she said. "But what we're seeing now is something much deeper. We're seeing how silence protects the wrong people. We're seeing how easy it is for authority to become abuse when no one stands up. But we're also seeing something else. We're seeing what happens when we do speak. When we don't back down." Her voice cracked slightly as she continued, and Malik reached for her hand. "My son was humiliated in front of his peers, not because he lied, but because someone decided he wasn't allowed to be proud. That his story didn't fit the narrative. But he spoke anyway. And now, you're all listening." From the corner of the stage, a representative from the Department of Education stepped forward. She introduced herself briefly, then addressed the entire assembly, announcing that an independent investigation would begin immediately, not just into Officer Malloy's behavior, but into every complaint filed against him over the last 10 years. Every transfer. Every dismissed report. Every child who might have been silenced. She invited anyone who had a story to come forward, publicly or privately. The school would no longer be a fortress for harm. It would become a place for truth. And then something extraordinary happened. A parent in the middle row stood. A tall man with dark glasses and a firm voice. "He did it to my nephew too," he said. 2 years ago. Said he looked too suspicious walking home after a basketball game. Another voice joined from the side. "Malloy pushed my daughter against a locker and told her to calm her attitude after she corrected a teacher in class." Another parent. Another story. The room became a flood of voices, one after another, stories rising in volume, not chaotic, but unified, like a collective testimony too long buried. And through it all, Malik stood quietly, holding his father's hand, not overwhelmed, but steady, his courage mirrored in the room now filled with voices no longer afraid to speak. Later, in the hallway, as the crowd began to disperse, a group of reporters waited outside the school. News had already broken online. Clips from the assembly, quotes from the speeches, images of General Carter standing beside his son, it was all over social media. The narrative had changed. Malik was no longer just a boy who stood alone. He was the face of a movement, the spark of something bigger than himself. But even in the noise, in the growing attention, the media buzz, Malik remained quiet, focused. He didn't care about the cameras. He cared about what happened next. Back inside, in a more private space, Principal Simmons requested a moment alone with the Carters. He closed the office door behind them and sat down, shoulders heavy. "I failed," he said, "no pretense, no excuse. I didn't protect him. I didn't listen. I let fear guide my choices." Carter looked at him, voice low but direct. "Then make sure your fear doesn't shape your next ones." Simmons nodded. "I'm stepping down at the end of the semester. But before I go, I'm going to make some changes. Policies. Training. Hiring practices. This won't be the school's legacy. Malik deserves better. All of our kids do. Malik met his gaze, not with anger, but with clarity. It's not about being a hero, he said. It's about not being invisible. That evening, back at home, the family sat together on the couch, the television playing quietly in the background, showing footage from the day's events. Denise leaned against her husband's shoulder. Malik sat with his feet curled under him, holding a cup of cocoa. He watched himself on the screen but didn't feel disconnected. He saw a kid who told the truth even when it cost him. He saw a mother who stood beside him, a father who showed the world who they were, a community that finally spoke out. His father turned to him and said, "You were braver than me today." Malik looked at him, surprised. "But you're the general." Carter smiled gently. "And you're the reason I fight." The words hung in the air like a promise. Not just between father and son, but between past and future. Between what had been tolerated and what would no longer be. And though they knew the road ahead would be long, that systems didn't change overnight, they also knew this wasn't the end. This was the middle of something bigger. And Malik? He was just getting started. In the weeks that followed the assembly, the ripple effects of what had unfolded inside Jefferson Middle began to show their full reach. What started as a moment of personal humiliation had grown into a statewide investigation, and from that investigation came truths too heavy to ignore. The school board convened emergency meetings. The Office of Civil Rights submitted their first round of findings, and what they uncovered was more than a pattern, it was a culture. A system that had, for years, rewarded silence and punished discomfort. A place where students of color had repeatedly been disbelieved, dismissed, or disciplined for simply asserting their worth. For many in the city, this wasn't a revelation. But now, it was no longer hidden. It was printed in official reports, broadcasted on local news, and dissected in living rooms where parents once believed their children were safe just because they were in school. For Malik, the aftermath wasn't simple. There were interviews, visits from education officials, emails from advocacy groups, and strangers who approached him in grocery stores and parks, telling him how proud they were or how brave he'd been. He smiled, nodded, thanked them politely, but it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. The echo of what had been done, the weight of knowing there were others who hadn't had the chance to speak, made every compliment feel like a reminder of just how close he'd come to being invisible. He returned to school, and although his classmates treated him differently, some with admiration, some with guilt, he still felt like he was walking through two worlds, one where his truth had been proven, and another where it never should have been doubted in the first place. Inside the school, things were changing. The administration implemented a new restorative justice program, led by educators of color. Teachers were required to complete cultural competency training, and a new parent advisory committee was formed, giving families a voice in how policies were shaped. Officer Malloy's permanent removal from all school duties was confirmed, and his name was officially added to a statewide database of decertified school resource officers. But even as the institution began to bend toward accountability, the question lingered, would these changes last, or were they just a reaction to the spotlight? That question haunted Denise in particular. She had spent years trusting systems to protect her son. She had followed the rules, kept her head down, attended every parent-teacher conference, and taught Malik how to stay safe by being calm, by being careful, by being quiet. But now, watching him walk through those same halls with his head high, not because the world had changed, but because he had forced it to, she found herself reevaluating everything she had once believed about survival. Had she protected him by teaching him how to endure, or had she unintentionally prepared him to be silent in the face of harm? It was a question that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling while her son slept peacefully in the next room, unaware of the storm she still carried inside her. General Carter, too, found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had spent his life making decisions under pressure, commanding units, coordinating complex missions with lives on the line. But nothing had prepared him for the emotional complexity of watching his son navigate a public reckoning he never asked for. In the military, discipline and order ruled. There were procedures for everything. But in civilian life, especially in matters of race and injustice, the rules weren't as clear, and the stakes were often hidden, silent, psychological. He struggled with the urge to fix everything, to control the outcomes, but he knew this wasn't his battle to lead. Malik had taken that first step on his own. His job now was to walk beside him, not in front. One evening, the family sat down to dinner, something they hadn't done together in months before Carter's return. The table was quiet at first, the usual clatter of plates and silverware filling the space. Then Denise cleared her throat and asked Malik how he felt. Not what people were saying. Not what the news was reporting. Just, how he felt. Malik paused, fork halfway to his mouth, and set it down. He looked at his parents, their eyes locked on him, and for the first time in a long while, he spoke without calculation. I feel like everyone wants me to be okay now, he said, his voice low. Like they think because something changed, it means I'm fine. But I still think about that day. About how nobody stood up. Not even the teachers. I keep wondering what would have happened if Dad hadn't come back. If that video didn't exist. Would anyone have believed me? Neither parent spoke at first. Denise reached across the table, taking his hand in hers, holding it tightly. Carter leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. Sometimes, justice isn't about winning. It's about forcing the world to look. And you did that. You made them look. That's power. Malik nodded slowly, but his eyes held more questions than answers. As the investigation expanded, it uncovered not only Malloy's misconduct but a web of failures by those who had enabled him. Principals who transferred him instead of disciplining him. Officers who ignored complaints. Teachers who witnessed incidents but stayed silent to avoid conflict. These revelations sparked heated debates across the city. Some community members demanded resignations, others feared backlash, and a few began questioning if they had ever really known the schools their children attended. The media attention grew more intense. News trucks were parked outside Jefferson Middle for days. Editorials flooded the local papers. Parents argued in school board meetings, some furious that their children were exposed to such tension, others demanding deeper changes. Malik's story became a lightning rod. Some called him a hero. Others accused the family of seeking attention. Trolls online questioned the truth of what happened, twisting facts and posting photoshopped images. But through it all, Malik stayed grounded, not because he was immune, but because he had already faced the worst kind of dismissal, and survived it. Eventually, the Department of Education announced a public forum to address the findings of the investigation. It was scheduled to be held at a local community center, open to anyone who wanted to speak. The Carters were invited to attend, and though hesitant at first, Malik agreed. He didn't want to relive it all, but he understood now that silence only served those who feared truth. The auditorium that night was filled beyond capacity. Rows of folding chairs, standing room only, cameras in the back. Parents, teachers, activists, students, all waiting. Malik stood at the podium, heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He looked out at the crowd, saw faces he recognized and others he didn't. He cleared his throat, then began, not with a speech, but with a question. How many kids like me had to go through this before someone said enough? The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was reverent. He continued, telling his story, not for pity, but for accountability. He spoke of truth, of fear, of silence, of what it means to be told your story doesn't matter until someone else confirms it. And when he finished, the applause wasn't loud or explosive. It was slow, steady, building, not like a celebration, but like recognition. Acknowledgement. Respect. After he stepped down, others came forward. Parents who had never spoken in public before. Former students who carried their own stories in silence. One by one, the room became a chorus of voices that had once been scattered but now felt like part of something unified. A reckoning. A declaration. And yet, beneath it all, a moral tension still lingered. A question that no policy change could easily resolve. What does redemption look like for those who enabled harm? Can a system built on silence truly change, or does it simply shift its shape, adapting to scrutiny until the spotlight fades? Malik didn't have the answers. Neither did his parents. But they knew the questions had finally been asked out loud. That was something. As the night ended and the crowd began to leave, a man in a dark jacket approached Carter outside the building. He introduced himself quietly, an officer from another district. He'd seen Malloy transferred years ago, said nothing at the time. And now he couldn't sleep. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. Just a truth he had carried too long. "I should have said something," the man whispered. "But I didn't know how." Carter didn't offer comfort. He didn't let him off the hook. But he nodded, once. "Then learn now," he said. "And don't stay quiet again." In that moment, under the parking lot lights, the cost of silence became something real, not just a concept, not just a line in a report, but a weight, a debt, responsibility. And for the first time, it felt like the people carrying it might actually be ready to face it. Back in the car, Malik looked out the window as the city passed by in shadows and lights. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a victim either. He felt like a boy who had been seen. And in a world that so often demanded invisibility from people who looked like him, that was everything. And still, something inside him whispered, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something that had no name yet. But it was coming. The weeks that followed the public forum blurred into a steady wave of consequences and reckonings, each more surreal than the last. The Department of Education began implementing emergency reforms throughout the district, releasing detailed findings from their investigation into officer misconduct and institutional negligence across several schools, not just Jefferson Middle. Media outlets began airing follow-up stories, not only about Malik and his father but also highlighting students from other districts who had come forward with similar accounts of humiliation, doubt, and systemic silence. For the first time, the invisible patterns that had endured quietly for years were being mapped, exposed, and addressed. But inside the Carter household, none of it felt like celebration. It felt like truth had finally breached the surface, and now everyone had to learn how to breathe in this new air. Malik sat at the kitchen table one evening, his fingers slowly turning the pages of a letter he had received from a student across the state. The boy's name was Elijah, and his story was hauntingly familiar. A science fair. A dispute over a project. A white teacher accusing him of cheating. A school resource officer making a comment about how, kids like you don't usually build things like this. Elijah hadn't spoken up then, but after hearing Malik's story on the news, he found the courage. Malik read every word carefully, the ache of recognition sinking deeper into his chest. Denise noticed his stillness and sat beside him quietly, reading over his shoulder without saying a word. After a long pause, Malik looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Why do they think we're lying, Mom? Why do they always assume we're pretending to be more than we are?" Denise placed a hand on his back, her thumb tracing soft circles through his shirt as she searched for the right words. "Because they've been taught to believe there's only one version of power," she said slowly. "And when they see it in you, quiet, young, black, they don't know how to handle it. So instead of learning, they reject it. They protect what they're used to. Even if it's wrong." Malik's eyes dropped back to the letter. "I didn't want to make people feel uncomfortable. I just wanted to be heard." "You did both," she replied. "And sometimes that's what it takes. Change doesn't come from comfort. It comes when people can't ignore the truth anymore." Across the room, General Carter stood at the counter, coffee in hand, listening. His expression was unreadable, not because he didn't feel, but because every emotion in him was being held tightly, like a soldier gripping a rifle in hostile terrain. When Malik looked at him, there was a new depth in the way father and son met each other's gaze, a recognition, not of similarity, but of shared burden. They had walked different paths through the same fire, and now neither could pretend the world hadn't scorched them. Carter set the mug down and stepped closer, his voice low, textured with gravity. The system didn't expect you to fight back. It expected you to stay small. But you didn't. You exposed them, son. Not just Malloy, but the ones who protected him. That takes more strength than most men will ever understand. Malik nodded, but his lips pressed into a tight line. Then why does it still hurt? Carter didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, where the streetlights cast long shadows over the pavement, and finally said, because even when you win, you lose something. Innocence. Safety. The belief that people will do the right thing if you just give them the chance. You lost that. And it hurts like hell. At school, Malik was met with new eyes. Some peers looked at him with admiration, others with avoidance. Teachers walked more carefully around him, measuring their words. But not all change was superficial. The school had brought in counselors specifically trained in racial trauma. New workshops were offered. And perhaps most meaningfully, students were encouraged, truly encouraged, to speak out. Malik was asked to help co-lead a youth advisory panel, and after some hesitation, he agreed. He didn't want to be a symbol. But if his voice could make space for others, he'd use it. During one of the first meetings, a sixth-grade girl named Kayla spoke up, her voice trembling. She shared a moment when a hall monitor had accused her of skipping class even though she had a valid pass. The pass was torn up in front of her. No one had believed her. Her story was met with silence until Malik leaned forward and said, "What they did to you was wrong. And we believe you now." The shift in Kayla's face, relief, tears, relief again, was something Malik carried with him for days. In that moment, he understood something powerful: sometimes justice didn't roar. Sometimes it whispered in rooms where people were finally allowed to be vulnerable. Yet not everyone embraced the change. At a town hall forum a week later, a group of parents stood and argued that the school was overcorrecting, claiming that the new policies created division, that children were being taught to see race in everything. One parent accused the district of turning students into political weapons. The tension in the room was suffocating, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything was unraveling again. That was when Denise stood up. She hadn't planned to speak. But when she saw Malik's face tightening in the third row, the same face that had held in tears after that first day on the auditorium stage, she rose. And when she began to speak, her voice didn't tremble, it carved itself into the room like a chisel against stone. "My son was humiliated," she said, eyes fixed on the crowd. "Not because he lied. Not because he misbehaved. But because he dared to carry pride his community isn't often allowed to show. And the people who let it happen? They stayed silent. You think acknowledging racism divides us? No. Ignoring it does. Pretending our kids aren't affected by it every day does." The room was silent, uneasy. Denise's voice dropped lower. "If my son's story makes you uncomfortable, that's not his fault. That's a mirror. Look into it." The next morning, Malik hugged his mother before school and whispered thank you. She squeezed his hand and told him, "We're not just raising you to be strong. We're raising the world to stop asking you to be." Meanwhile, Officer Malloy's case escalated beyond internal hearings. Civil suits were being filed from multiple families. Depositions began, and retired officers came forward, testifying about complaints that had been buried, warnings that had been ignored. The state attorney general launched a probe into the department's handling of all school-assigned officers. Malloy's badge wasn't just revoked, it became a cautionary symbol of what unchecked bias looked like in uniform. But Malik, despite everything, still carried doubt. One night, after dinner, he sat on the porch with his father. The stars blinked overhead, and the air was cool and quiet. "Do you think it's really going to last?" Malik asked. "The changes. The policies. All of it. Or will people just forget again? Carter took a deep breath, his eyes on the horizon. People forget. Systems resist. But you built something they can't unsee. Even if they try, the story is out there now. And the next time it happens, and it will, someone else will know they're not alone. Malik leaned his head on his father's shoulder, feeling the heaviness between them and somehow lighter for sharing it. I don't want to be a symbol, he whispered. You're not, Carter replied. You're a standard. The beginning of a better way. And though neither said another word that night, they sat under the stars for a long time, listening to the quiet, knowing it was a quiet they had earned. But just as the world around them began to settle, an unexpected message arrived in Malik's school inbox the following morning. Anonymous. No subject line. No name. Just 3 lines typed into a plain white screen. He wasn't the only officer. There are more like him. And some are still in schools. I have proof. Malik stared at the screen, heart thudding. He looked over his shoulder, then back at the message. The fight wasn't over. The moment Malik read that anonymous email, a deep shiver ran through him, not out of fear but out of a heavy realization that what had happened to him, what had shaken his life and forced an entire city to look inward, was only a fraction of something much bigger. He sat at the school's computer lab staring at the screen long after the final bell rang, the usual shuffle of students packing their bags and teachers calling out reminders blurring into meaningless background noise. The 3 lines in that message stayed imprinted in his mind like a scar, simple, unpolished words that held the weight of a hidden truth. He wasn't the only officer. There are more like him. And some are still in schools. I have proof. For the first time since everything had erupted, Malik felt the ground under him begin to shift again, not in chaos, but in responsibility. If this was true, then the real reckoning hadn't even started. He printed the email without hesitation and walked straight to Principal Simmons' office. The hallway was empty now, quiet in a way that made every step echo like a heartbeat. When he knocked, Simmons looked up from behind his desk, surprised to see him. Malik didn't wait to be asked in. He entered, closed the door, and laid the printed message on the desk between them. Simmons read it slowly, his brow furrowing as he processed the lines. Then he looked up, meeting Malik's eyes with something between dread and reluctant resolve. Where did you get this? He asked. It was in my school email, Malik replied, his voice steady but low. No name. No clue who sent it. But it sounds real. Simmons sat back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders returning like it had never left. If this is true, then everything we've done so far has only scratched the surface. Malik nodded. Then we dig deeper. There was a long silence between them before Simmons finally reached for his phone. We'll loop in the Office of Civil Rights. But Malik, this might not be easy. People are already exhausted. Some think this story is over. Malik leaned forward, his voice firmer now. Then they're wrong. That night, at home, Malik showed the email to his parents. Denise read it first, her face still, then passed it to Carter, who studied the words like a field report, silently absorbing every possible implication. The room fell into silence as both parents processed the message, and Malik waited, unsure if they'd try to stop him or tell him it wasn't his responsibility. But instead, Carter looked up and asked, "Do you believe it's real?" "Yes," Malik said. "I feel it. This isn't just about Malloy. He was allowed to stay because no one looked deeper. What if there are others like him? Still out there?" Carter looked at his son, eyes narrowing with conviction. "Then we find them. And we make sure they don't stay hidden." Over the next several days, Malik began compiling stories, old blog posts, parent complaints, news clippings, even social media threads where former students from other schools described similar experiences. With the help of Ms. Andrews, one of the few teachers who had stood by him from the beginning, Malik began organizing the information. Andrews had access to internal school newsletters and district archives that weren't publicly searchable. Together, they began mapping out a timeline, comparing transfers, dates, and officer assignments. What emerged was chilling: familiar names, similar patterns, all brushed aside over the years as misunderstandings or disciplinary issues. It became clear that Malloy wasn't an outlier. He was part of a larger pattern: officers who quietly shifted from one campus to another when complaints arose, leaving a trail of damaged students in their wake. One afternoon, while working in the school library, Malik received another email from the anonymous source. This one had an attachment: scanned copies of disciplinary letters buried in personnel files, documents that had never been publicly released. One name stood out immediately: Officer Linwood. The file detailed 2 separate complaints, both from middle schools in the same district, involving students of color being targeted, searched without cause, and intimidated. Both times, the complaints were marked unsubstantiated. Both times, no action had been taken. The most disturbing part was that Officer Linwood was still active, and assigned to another school in the district. Malik stared at the screen, feeling his stomach twist. This wasn't hypothetical anymore. This wasn't history. It was still happening. Right now. And somewhere, another kid was sitting in a classroom, being watched by someone who wasn't there to protect them. He took the file to the school board liaison, who promised to escalate it immediately. But even as official channels were activated, Malik knew bureaucracy moved slow, often too slow. So he took the story public again. With the help of a local journalist who had covered his case early on, he released a statement, careful and measured, accompanied by excerpts of the documents and anonymized stories from students who had come forward. It spread quickly. Again, the internet responded, angry, awakened, but also afraid. The community realized that the rot wasn't just one man. It was a system stitched together by oversight and willful blindness. In the midst of this new storm, Denise pulled Malik aside one evening. Her face was tired, more than usual, and her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on his shoulders. "You've carried so much already," she said. "And now you're diving back into it, digging into pain that doesn't even belong to you. Are you sure this is what you want?" Malik looked at her, eyes older than his years. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's right. I can't let it go now. Not when I know there's more." Denise embraced him, holding him tighter than she had in months. Carter watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Later that night, he sat beside Malik and said something he hadn't shared before. "There were times during my deployments," he began, "when I saw things, saw men under my command make decisions that weren't right. I thought I could fix it by focusing on the mission. That if I just did my part well enough, the system would balance itself. But I was wrong. You can't fix a broken machine by ignoring the pieces that don't work. You're doing something I wasn't brave enough to do. Don't let anyone quiet you down." The following week, the school district held an emergency hearing, this time in a larger venue to accommodate the flood of public interest. Students, parents, and educators filled the room, many holding signs, some holding folders with their own complaints finally being unearthed. The superintendent stood at the podium, visibly strained, as she announced a sweeping audit of all school resource officers across the district. Immediate reassignments would occur. Independent reviewers would be brought in. And most importantly, any officer with unresolved complaints would be suspended pending investigation. Malik sat in the front row, surrounded by his family and Ms. Andrews. When the superintendent acknowledged him by name, there was a long pause before she continued. "You reminded us what courage looks like," she said. "You refused to let silence win. We owe you more than thanks, we owe you change." But even with those words, Malik knew the work wasn't done. After the hearing, he was approached by a boy no older than 10, holding his mother's hand tightly. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide, then whispered, "He said my hoodie made me look suspicious." Malik knelt down to his level and replied, "You don't ever have to be sorry for how you exist." And in that moment, he saw something shift in the boy's expression, like a small part of the shame he carried had finally been named, and therefore, could be released. The night ended quietly, the crowd filtering out under the streetlights. Malik stood with his family in the parking lot, watching people hug, cry, and talk in low, emotional tones. His father wrapped an arm around his shoulder and said, "You didn't just start something, son. You built something. And it's going to outlive all of us." But even as those words settled in, Malik felt the vibration of his phone. Another anonymous message. Just 4 words this time. "There's still one more." He looked at the screen, then out into the darkness. The battle wasn't over. And he would not look away. Months passed and the city slowly began to transform in ways both visible and subtle. Across the district, changes that had once seemed impossible were now becoming permanent policy. School resource officers underwent new rounds of psychological evaluations, community-led panels were installed to oversee disciplinary complaints, and a wave of administrative resignations signaled a new era of accountability. But it wasn't just about documents and reforms. It was about faces, stories, and the undeniable truth that had emerged from the voices of students who refused to be silenced. What had started as humiliation for one child had become a movement led by him, and in the process, had forced a system to reckon with its failures. And for Malik, everything changed. He was no longer just the boy who spoke at an assembly. He was invited to Washington, D.C., to sit on a National Youth Advisory Board focused on education equity and school safety. He didn't want cameras, he didn't want fame, but he understood the power of the platform he now carried. At a roundtable discussion, surrounded by senators, educators, and advocates, he looked each of them in the eye and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had paid for every word with personal experience. He didn't ask for sympathy. He demanded action. He demanded that no other child be forced to prove their worth before being believed. And when he finished speaking, there was no applause, only silence, and then quiet nods of understanding. Because what he said didn't need celebration. It needed commitment. Back in Charlotte, Officer Malloy's name disappeared from city rosters entirely. After several lawsuits, public scrutiny, and internal review, he lost all qualifications to serve in any law enforcement capacity. His appeal attempts were swiftly denied after testimonies from dozens of students and families exposed a long pattern of psychological intimidation and bias. There was no dramatic arrest, no press conference. It ended with a quiet ruling, a final statement that echoed like a verdict not just on him, but on every adult who had let it happen for years. And while many would forget his name in time, Malik didn't. Not out of bitterness, but because he had learned something powerful: accountability doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like removal. Like the silence that follows when someone dangerous is no longer in the room. Principal Simmons announced his early retirement, but before leaving, he implemented a district-wide mentorship program where students would be paired with leaders from their communities. His resignation letter was published publicly, not as an excuse, but as an admission, a personal reckoning in which he confessed that fear had kept him from doing what was right, and that silence had made him complicit. That letter became a teaching tool in training sessions for new school administrators. Malik never saw Simmons again, but he respected the choice to leave with truth instead of hiding behind a polished exit. Ms. Andrews, the teacher who stood by Malik when others turned away, was promoted to a district leadership role. Her advocacy, once overlooked, became central to the restructured educational reform initiatives. She stayed in touch with Malik, and together they launched a scholarship program for students who had faced systemic injustice in their schooling, each award named after students who had once been silenced. The first recipient? Elijah, the boy who had emailed Malik after seeing his story. He now had the funding to attend the STEM camp he once believed was out of reach. As for Malik, he returned to school with purpose, but not the same way he once had. His eyes saw everything now, every imbalance, every biased glance, every moment when truth sat waiting to be acknowledged. But he carried it not with weight, but with wisdom. He joined the student council, began mentoring younger students, and organized monthly town hall meetings that invited honest, sometimes uncomfortable dialogue. He wasn't trying to fix everything. He was trying to make it possible for others to speak before breaking. Denise found peace in ways she hadn't expected. For years, she'd been holding in so much, fear for her son, worry that one mistake would define him, exhaustion from fighting battles with a smile. But now she watched him stand tall, not because the world had gotten easier, but because he had learned how to stand even when it didn't. She returned to school herself, working toward a degree in education policy. She told her professors that she wasn't studying theory, she was studying survival. And she was going to change the way schools see their children. General Carter was offered several public speaking opportunities and even interviews with major networks, but he declined most of them. His pride wasn't in the spotlight. It was in his son's resilience. One evening, he and Malik stood on the roof of their building, looking out at the city skyline. The air was quiet, the stars clear. "You know," Carter said, "when I used to give orders, I expected men to follow. But watching you, seeing what you've done without ever having rank or uniform, Malik, you've led more people than I ever did." Malik didn't respond right away. Then he said, "I didn't want to lead. I just wanted them to listen." Carter smiled. That's exactly what leaders say before they realize that listening is where the power starts. As the school year neared its end, the final anonymous message was traced back to a retired school secretary who had kept copies of internal memos for years. She stepped forward anonymously in the press, confirming a decade-long pattern of relocating problematic officers rather than investigating them. Her evidence, now part of an open case, would likely result in criminal charges for those who had knowingly covered up abuses. Malik was never told her name. She never wanted credit. She just wanted justice. And maybe that was the most powerful thing Malik learned: some people fight from the shadows, quietly, and when their truth is finally seen, it becomes part of a much louder story. Now, to you who watched or listened to this story, take a moment to sit with what you've just heard. This wasn't just a tale about a boy and a badge. It was about silence. About how silence isn't neutral. It either protects the oppressor or empowers the truth. It's about what happens when systems built to protect some begin to destroy others. It's about what happens when one child decides that enough is enough, and refuses to shrink. What about you? Have you ever been made to feel small when you were telling the truth? Have you ever seen someone be silenced and wondered if stepping in was your place? This story challenges all of us, not just to see injustice, but to disrupt it. Because sometimes justice doesn't come roaring in with flashing lights and grand speeches. Sometimes it starts with a whisper. A truth. A refusal to stay quiet. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or reminded you of something important, leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your voice. Because voices, when joined together, become movements. And if you want more stories like this, full of truth, tension, heart, and unexpected turns, make sure you hit that subscribe button to join our community here at Tales of Twist. New stories are coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss them.